It is my pleasure this morning to introduce Kevin Smith, the CEO of QS-NTS. We'll have half an hour of presentation, followed by 10 minutes of question time, and I'm going to abide by that schedule ruthlessly, so have your questions prepared. Kevin is going to speak to us today on the relevance, role and response of native title to an expanding Indigenous affairs landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Kevin Smith.
Thank you very much, David. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the Yuggera and Yugarapu people, the traditional owners of the land on which we're having this important conversation. I also want to acknowledge traditional owners online and in the audience. I especially want to acknowledge Uncle Des Sandy, who I don't think he's here at the moment, but he was here yesterday. Uncle Des is an important Brisbane elder and he's played a significant role in the whole SEQ area, just not for Brisbane, so I wanted to acknowledge him. And I also wanted to acknowledge Michael Aird, an important Aboriginal academic that contributes a lot to this SEQ area, and obviously working in an august institution like UQ, it's good to have Aboriginal voices in organisations like this, so I wanted to make some acknowledgements there. This presentation probably adds on to a presentation that I made this time last year to the CNTA, and it was around a presentation around people, place and partnership, and I'm sure that presentation is up on the CNTA workshop, so please feel free to have a look at those. But also the thoughts that I'm going to share with you today also comes out of a conference that was in Canberra this time last year as well, where I was asked to speak at the IATSIS conference around co-design and policy. And I went to that audience, to a room full of policy makers, thinking no one here will understand what native title is, let alone what Indigenous rights are. And I started to try to unpack the relevance of native title and Indigenous rights to policy. But then in the intervening 12 months, and what a year it was, there was a lot of things that occurred in the environment that actually just rammed home the importance of native title, Indigenous rights and the broader policy landscape. And I want to touch upon some of those things in this presentation. I am preparing a more detailed paper, and it's actually been sent to IATSIS for hopefully publication. And for some of the things that are in here, you know, once it's published, then, you know, obviously it can be unpacked a little bit more, but I'm going to skim across the top of my thesis here. Now let's see if I get this right. So really, I just want to talk about four things generally, but there's a lot in there. I just want to make some observations of the operating environment from where we work on a daily basis, but also some policy settings that are actually starting to come forward. And just, you know, try to have a, you know, just to put them out there. There won't be time to get into all the detail of those, but just, you know, just to skim across the top so people get to see the magnitude of what we're talking about. I then want to talk about some responses to that environment, and I'm going to use, you know, strategic management speak, but, you know, you do have to have a theory of change when you're looking at these things, and I've got a very busy schema, and I'll put that up there, but, you know, I just really want to focus on a few stages in that schema. And then I want to actually have a conversation about bringing it back to TOs, PBCs and rep bodies, because how will those three groups of people manage this environment? And then I think there are some specific rep body issues that we will need to deal with as we navigate the landscape. So, you eat an elephant one bite at a time, so I'm just trying to break these things down. Look, the operational workload that we are all under at the moment, it's self-evident. Where the claims are, we've got something like over 450 positive determinations. I think there are over 500 determinations in total, or over 500. But I'm only interested in the positive determinations. So we've got a critical mass of, you know, of determinations. There's something like 170 odd claims still in the system, Chris. Something nationally.
Isn't it, I think it's just under 200.
Okay, so you can see from that, from the 450 to 200 odd, we've reached a tipping point in native title. So we've got the critical mass of determinations have been knocked over. What we've got to do now, the work is the gap areas, so where we've actually secured determinations and we've strategically parked certain areas, the gap areas will be the areas that we need to focus on. And I say that they're going to be the difficult ones, they're going to be the challenging ones, because you'll actually have invariably people that have got contiguous determinations having a fight over the gap area, and it's how we actually, work through those things that's going to be important. So the workload might be diminishing, but it's becoming more complex in nature. Justice Mortimer made mention of compensation yesterday, and look, we had the Timber Creek judgment in 2019, and there's been a lot to digest. The National Native Title Council and rep bodies are slowly trying to digest that and how we might apply that more broadly. And I think COVID probably, just put that in sleep mode. It's not going to be in sleep mode now. I think people, now that you've got a determination, people want to have compensation claims. So how we actually deal with compensation is important. Variation of determinations, I think that's just going to be part of the landscape. So wanting to revisit the determinations that some of those 460, I think that's just going to be part of the landscape and how we actually deal with that. Cultural heritage, the interface with cultural heritage, as the Juukan Gorge issue has actually demonstrated, is going to become more prominent, but it's actually a matter of our day-to-day business, isn't it? We actually, cultural heritage is the flip side of native title. You just can't deal with one of those in isolation. You do need to deal with both of them. PBC support, so we've got 226 PBCs currently in the system across the country, and they are in variable stages of maturation, but I would say the lion's share of PBCs need a lot of support. And then there's the big issue of implementation of the determination rights, but also the agreements that sit under those. So there's a whole lot of work just in the operational space. But then you've got the emerging issues, and the native title amendments were passed earlier this week, and they have been a long time coming. We've had many parliaments prorogued in the meantime, but now we've actually got a big act that actually needs a lot of unpacking, and how it actually rolls out over the next couple of years is going to be a big challenge for everyone. There's CATSI Act amendments that will come through that will impact upon PBCs. The Juukan Gorge response, that's a big piece, and the importance of cultural heritage. And cultural heritage is tenure blind. It doesn't matter whether there's native title there or not. It actually is over the whole country, and so how we actually work with cultural heritage is going to be important. Transparency and accountability is really an issue that's going to come through a range of things, and it's transparency, and I probably want to focus more on transparency between the traditional owner group, the native title holders, the people who are possessed of the native title, and the PBC, and line of sight between those two. And it's not to say that all agreements have to be open to the public. That's a matter between the group and the PBC. But I think that we've got some challenges there. So the amendments does help in some respect there, but there's still a lot of work. UNDRIP is starting to get some traction, and I'll talk a little bit more around that later. Comprehensive settlements, I think, is self-evident, but if we're going to be talking about compensation, I think comprehensive settlement needs to have an eye on compensation as well. So it's just another way of resolving it. And I actually just want to make one other comment. And there was a very important case of Love and Toms last year by the High Court, and that's, can an Aboriginal person be considered an alien in our own country? And there's just a very short extract that I want to read because it actually contextualises this concept of that's evolving. And it's from Justice Gordon, and she says, "It is a connection with land and waters that is unique to Aboriginal Australians. As history has shown, that connection is not simply a matter of what the common law would classify as property. It is a connection which existed and persisted before and beyond settlement, before and beyond the assertion of sovereignty, and before and beyond federation. It is older and deeper than the Constitution, and the connection with land and waters that is unique to Aboriginal Australians does not exist in a vacuum. It was not and is not uniform. It was not and is not static. Cultures change and evolve, and because the spiritual or religious is translated into the legal, the integrated view of the connection of Aboriginal Australians to land and waters is fragmented. But this is the thing I want to focus on. But the tendency to think only in terms of native title rights and interests must be curbed. So Justice Gordon is actually challenging us to think outside our own little box of connection, native title, sui generis, it's over there. We need to think more broadly about the importance of connection to other things. And that particular judicial comment, to me, is actually, just like Justice Brennan's comment to Mabo number 2, I think how that is applied more broadly is important. Now, I've got a lot to cover, and I'm just carrying on a bit. So, Indigenous affairs, the policy, look, voice to government. So the interim report to the voice of government was handed down last December, and there's going to be a very big consultation process about that. But it obviously, as we all know, it came from the rejection of the Uluru Statement and how how voices might get to Parliament, to government, and the like. And what is coming out of that interim report is really important. So. And we have to be cognizant of it. Treaty processes are going on all around the country. In Queensland, Northern Territory, Victoria, of course, and South Australia started some work there, but I think it's a matter of time before treaty is really is prosecuted in a more meaningful way. And the Close the Gap refresh, so last year, all the way during COVID here, you had the first time where you had Commonwealth government, state and territory governments and local governments and the coalition of peaks actually having a whole of system discussion about how you might achieve reduction in or how you might close the gap. And in those conversations there was talk about the importance of local level decision making and the role of local people. And I think finally, COVID, because there was this hiatus last year, I think in any economic recovery there's going to be a stimulus. That will then impact upon the cultural heritage work, it will impact upon Future Act work, and there's no stopping that. And I think also that climate change will have an impact. The policy on climate change, or what might happen, will have an impact. And it's a double-edged sword because a lot of our TOs get a revenue stream from mining, but obviously if there's changes in the way that, if there's a resource shortages in that area, then TOs are going to have to find another resource mechanism. And we know tourism was considered to be Plan B in a COVID context. That's not going to be a viable Plan B. So I think, just like the broader economy, Indigenous communities need to have a more diverse service way of obtaining resources. Now, so the recurring themes in all of those things I was just talking about is this principle of Indigenous self-determination. And it's spoken about a lot, Indigenous self-determination, but what I'm picking up is, do we actually have a really good understanding of what that big concept is? And it's best articulated in the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. It's best articulated there because it is the sum of many Indigenous groups from around the world meeting for over a decade, 2 decades, over in Geneva, talking about what is important for us as Indigenous people. So it is the blueprint for a range of things. So I actually characterise this principle as an aspiration, as an organising principle. It is a process, and it is also an outcome. And I think we've got to get a really good working handle on what this concept of Indigenous self-determination is, and also what is free, prior and informed consent. I mean, that is also one of the rights associated with the flip side, I suppose, or actually a mitigating factor of people coming in a coexistent situation. If you're going to do business on country, you need to get free, prior and informed consent. And I also just briefly want to say that the word self-determination as a policy started back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and and I think Kevin's presentation yesterday around the leadership that was moving towards self-determination was really excellent. But remember that a lot of the Indigenous organisations came to be at a time prior to the recognition of native title and prior indeed to the promulgation of UNDRIP. And so in many respects, Indigenous organisations that were established under the principle of self-determination were in fact a response to racial discrimination. It was about how do we have equitable access to a range of services, legal, health, housing and the like. And this is how we reconcile, the big organisations that have been around for a long time and how those organisations work on country, I think is really an interesting space that we need to unpack. The second principle I want to talk about is subsidiarity. Now, if you go through all these presentations to voice to government, closing the gap, there's this concept of decision making really should be at the level which is most appropriate. And if we're talking about addressing Indigenous disadvantage and a range of things, it should be at where it occurs. And so decision making should be at that level. And it's a pretty powerful concept because that is the way governments organise themselves. You have obviously a federal government, a state territory government, and you have local governments. So there's a principle of subsidiarity that's operating there. And it's actually how we might apply that principle and align the concepts in there. So critical to that concept is bottom-up and place-based planning. So there are lots of opportunities and threats and all that, and I'm sure in the breakout groups you'll have some conversations. But I think the opportunities really are around how we might get alignment of things at a local level and how we might get integration at different levels. The threats, though, is that if we leave traditional owners, if we continue to assign traditional owners as the object, just picking up on Justice Mortimer's comment yesterday, if traditional owners are just the object in these changes, then and we remove agency from them, then you think we're going to have any efficacy in what comes out? Do you think people are going to buy into those things? So it's really important that we don't continue to make the mistakes of not including TOs in process. That involves power sharing, and with power sharing means someone has to give up power. We probably need to resist the temptation to think that functional organisation is the sole way of moving ahead with things. And what I mean by that is legal services talking to attorney generals, housing organisations talking to, we actually just kind of like we're organising ourselves around government programs. We've actually got to shake up that paradigm and say, yes, look, those organisations are important and are critical to delivering on closing the gap initiatives and the like, but it's actually how you work in with TOs on the ground. And we can't be sequential anymore. The luxury of doing things sequentially, I would submit, are over. And that's a challenge. Okay, so if we're going to if we're going to think of all these things, these are the things that I think are fundamental to any theory of change. My view is that it has to be rights focused, because in the absence of rights, you actually have the whim of government, the churn of electoral cycles and all this white noise, and I use that small white, I suppose, going on. And we need some protections in this, and rights are the way to actually deal with this. It's got to be strengths-based. There's a lot of language around the deficits, but there are many strengths that Indigenous people bring to the table. And I think we actually, as Indigenous people, have to start acknowledging that and maybe reframing what that might mean. What are the strengths? And it may not necessarily be bricks and mortar, healthy bank balances and share portfolios, although that might be where you get to. There are other ways of looking at capital, and we need to have a serious conversation about that. I think we need to be cognizant of two world governance. And the challenge to everyone in this room, people might say, well, what the hell does that mean? I actually say that everyone in this room and online and in our whole sector works in two-world governance. If you're an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander, we practice two-world governance every day. You people who work in this area advise about two-world governance, because essentially native title is how, you know, traditional laws and customs and common law, and what comes in the middle is how you might govern those rights. And I think that we have some really important thought leaders in this area, and I might embarrass people, but I think Di Smith and Tony Bowman and David Martin, you know, as anthropologists have looked at what's going on, and I think that they've got some really important contributions. And so if we're talking about collaboration, I think it's actually how we get all those people to talk together about these kind of things. I won't go too much about self-determination, because I will talk about that in a tick. I think if it's going to be sustainable, it's got to be inclusive. The days of key people holding all the knowledge, that's gone, because it can't be sustainable, because as we spoke about yesterday, when relationships are formed around individuals and knowledge is possessed by individuals, if something happens to those individuals, that's a shocker. You know, you get bad things will happen. And so we've got to be inclusive about any model of change, and it's got to be intergenerational. So succession planning and all those types of things really got to be really are critical. And scalability is important. So going back to that concept of subsidiarity, the model needs to be local, regional and national, and it's how we actually get that fit. Now, I'm just conscious that I'm 25 minutes into it, and so I will try to speed things up. Now, the word coexistence in this, can I just say, that might sound like kumbaya stuff, but as I've gone, in my own life journey in this area, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I was happy for our area, Queensland South area, to just get the holy grail of legal recognition. Can we just get the native title determination? And then it's moved to, well, that's just a step in a process. What is the end game? And the end game then moved to Indigenous self-determination, and I think that is still one of the goals. But I'm actually starting to think, well, if you're living in a settler society and we keep having these blues around Invasion Day, Australia Day, and all these things, we've got to move to self-determination for what? It's self-determination for something else, and I would say it's coexistent. And if you think it's kumbaya, well, read the preamble of the Act, the Native Title Act, and also look at Section 225. I mean, that's around how do these rights talk to each other. They're the principles in the theory of change. Now, this is where you're all going to have bleeding eyes, because this is the model, this is the theory of change. And I did ask if this could be blown up, or expanded a little bit more, but it can't be. But it's going to be in my PowerPoint, and you can all have a look at it. And look, there's a lot to unpack there. And I just suppose you just want to go from, there's a historical phase there, but there's stages, and it's a theory of change to actually map out what you need to do and when you might need to do it, and what the ultimate goals might be. So it talks about sovereignty. I mean, we need to deal with this concept of sovereignty. And so Indigenous cultures, we are sovereign, but then you actually had the assertion of sovereignty by the British, and then you actually had a whole range of impacts. And those impacts have impacted upon social, political, economic and legal structures. And I think the whole closing the gap and all the things that we're talking about are all impacts occurred over the last 200 odd years. And we need just to understand those different dimensions. But this phase here, this is securing the Indigenous estate and having a broader concept of what might the Indigenous estate comprise is important. and it's securing native title, but it's also all the agreements that are under the native title, but it's cultural heritage, it's also other land rights regimes and the like, and it's actually consolidating that. So where we're going now with gap areas, you know, it's important for TO groups to sort out those gap areas so we can actually map out the estate, map out in a boundary sense what the estate is, and then start putting some policies, start putting some strategies in place that are place-based. But that consolidation of the Indigenous estate is important. So, and as I was saying, 170 or 200 claims left to go. There's still work to do, but we've got to walk and chew gum at the same time, to pick up a Justice Dowsett-ism, one of his favourite sayings. And I think that's what we need to do now. So this other phase here, so in this phase here, my thesis is that the theory of change has to be rights focused, because we can't be dependent upon governments, or we can't rely upon governments to do the right thing. We actually do need to have a good civics education program around this, and I've just told you about what all that comprises, so I won't go through those things. The next thing is capital, and this is why I made mention of the people, place and partnership presentation I made last year. It's actually the bare bones. It's who are the people? So mapping out the people, what are the skill sets, where they live and so forth, mapping out country, so knowing where sites are and the like. And importantly, what are the relationships? So what are the, what's in Section 225? How do you unpack that? How do you unpack all those Indigenous land use agreements? They're the things that are based on rights, but you want to move away from rights. You actually want to leverage the relationship of that causes that relationship to come into place, and their rights. So rethinking capital along those lines is a way to actually start thinking about these things. Because I can tell you at a meeting last year, the Buntha Mara people, and they don't mind me talking about this, when we had our workshop, they started the meeting with native title rings hollow. We've got coexistent right, everyone else's right is above ours, and we don't really know why we went through this. At the end of the workshop, when we went through this mapping of people, mapping of place, mapping of relationships, there was a different mindset that came, and I think all rep bodies are doing this, but we just need to have a focused conversation about how we rethink capital. And governance, that last one up there, well, it shouldn't be the last, it's critical. And it actually, what I'm getting about cultural governance and intercultural governance, cultural governance is the mob's business. And to me, UNDRIP is actually a good blueprint as to how mob should actually organise themselves around social, economic, political, and potentially legal, because there is some residual lawmaking from an internal perspective. Obviously, it's not projected more broadly to other people, but UNDRIP actually does a good job of actually working out the internal cultural governance. But then the intercultural governance is everything else. It is everything else. It is the Native Title Act, it's the PBC regulations, it's the PBC, because the PBC is occupying an intercultural space. And so the mistake that people make is that the PBC is self-determining. No, people self-determine. Institutions do the bidding of people, and if you have harmony between the institutions and the people, that's where you get good intercultural fit. The third component is, so all of this is internal. So all of that there is internal. And there's a lot of work that's associated with that. And then what I would say is once we sort out this stuff, then we get into what I'm classifying as reorientation, coordination and partnership. It's actually how people are asserting all of these things in a place-based context. So it's talking to everyone on the other side of an agreement. It's talking to policymakers in an area. It's talking to other Indigenous organisations that are doing services on country. So we start coordinating things properly. And that is a lot of work there. And so, but these are the building blocks I'm submitting. Secure your Indigenous estate. Understand what your rights are that underpin the estate. Rethink capital. get your governance right. Make sure you understand when you say cultural governance, are you actually talking about PBC governance, which is a compliance regime, or the Native Title Act, Future Act regime? That's all compliance. That's a different thing. And I think we have a good understanding of those types of things. And so you move that in there. Now, so just to speed this up, because I know David's going to pull me up soon. Look, that's when I put self-determination, and I've put autonomy and sovereignty. Now, we could have lots of arguments about what is sovereignty, what is self-determination, but I think it's autonomy. And when you actually get all of these things sorted out, reorientating from a place-based perspective, that's when you actually have people, so non-traditional owners and non-Indigenous people actually recognising, and that's when you actually get this thing called Indigenous self-determination, because it does need recognition of your status of self-determining. We could all run around and say we're self-determining, but that's not going to actually do anything unless we interface in a coexistent model, okay? And so what we move to then is, this is probably getting to areas of the power imbalance. There's lots of talk over the last day or so about the power imbalance. You start getting those building blocks right, then you start having a meaningful conversation around negotiation about a different future. And it can occur at a local level. And I think the model is portable to a regional level, because we all deal with regional societies where laws and customs are held at a higher level but are exercised at a local level. I think you can do a model that loops back, and you go, once you've actually got individual groups sorted out, if they're part of the same regional society, you might then loop back again and do this, and then you then scale it up regionally. And then nationally might be a different conversation. That's when I think we start to have a real conversation about level playing field, power equivalence, and we start getting into a different space about what coexistence might look like. Okay, and I've only got one more slide. I've already spoken about that. All right, so just from a rep body perspective. Oh, thanks.
We're going to cut in. Sorry, Julie.
Can I just have a drink of water then?
Session, just because this is, I think, a very, very interesting talk, and you have a lot to talk about. So we'll cut into the next discussion time a little bit. So just take it.
Look, it's the last slide. But my point, there's a lot of stuff that we have to do as a sector, because we understandably have been focused on the hard churn, the work, and it's been really difficult to get our heads above the parapet. I accept that. I say these things to my staff and they think I'm mad because they actually know they're still in the trenches doing the work. But I actually just say, look, we would be dinosaurs with an ice age coming if we don't actually start thinking about these things. We need to move into a different environment, or we will actually miss the boat. So to mix metaphors terribly there, but so we've got to really start thinking about things more broadly. So we have to have a whole of policy environment. We actually have to change the mindset of the way that we do things. Our organisation is grappling with how do we actually provide whole of client services, whole of organisation services to whole of client need. And we've kicked goals by being very process focused. We got our first determination for the Quandamooka people 10 years ago, and we've used a very strict process line. But in this chaos world, we actually have to move away from that. So how do we actually deal with all the needs of a client? How do we bring all the organisation's knowledge to bear on dealing with these issues? And that's a challenge. But you need to have a value that says all of our services, all of our the way we think is to actually meet client need. The interdisciplinary approach, this is really how it happens. there's been lots of talks about, there's lawyers and there's anthros and there's the field officers, Indigenous community officers, and we all have our silos. If we're going to have a whole of client, whole of organisation approach, the primary team has to be the interdisciplinary team, and you get the support from your anthro colleagues and your legal colleagues on other things, but the primary focus has to be the client team, and that has to be interdisciplinary because the problems are of an interdisciplinary nature. And so focusing on that is really important. And I know that, rep bodies have moved from those different models. We went from specialisation, we went from, just lawyers and all that business, from interdisciplinary to then breaking it up. And now we're actually thought, well, if we're going to do this work, we actually have to go back to where we started. So, and that's going to be each organisation's journey. This concept around moving from specialists to generalists, that will frighten the hell out of a lot of people, because this area is complex, and you've built up a particular expertise around certain areas. But as the environment is moving, some of these things are going to become redundant. And unless we actually, and it's in the benefit of our clients that we actually move those skills along with their journey as well. So our thinking is lawyers no longer can be native title specialists, and you go off to your Future Act unit for this and you go off to your PBC unit for that, because at the end of the day, when the native title claim's knocked over, you're then having to build that person's capacity to deal with his other areas of work. So you cannot be a specialist in a niche area along those fields from a legal point of view, and I think that's a challenge. That's a challenge for my staff. From an anthropological point of view, it's actually how you might use anthropological skills, genealogical skills, and the like to look more at community development. So how you actually bring those skill sets into that area, and that's a challenge. I think we've got to reinvest the resources and the knowledge, because as we talked about yesterday, budget, funding is a killer in this area. So it's actually how we might be able to reuse connection reports for multiple purposes. Compensation's coming, how you might use the connection report for that, how you might use it for PBC design, how you might use it for dispute resolution in a cultural governance context, and indeed an intercultural governance context. There's lots of things. So all of this stuff, it's within our brain cells. We've just got to think differently about how we're using it. The collaboration point is around the community of practice ethos. So how, we won't be able to do everything. So having the CNTA, AATSIS, and a range of other institutes out there doing the thinking and assisting is going to be important. So a development of a community of practice, and rep bodies, TOs and PBCs going through this stuff as well. Harnessing technology is critical. You won't be able to do this stuff if you're operating off, pieces of paper like I still do. So it's going to, we're just going to have to harness technology. And can I just finish on one point, because it's an important one. It's the funding issue. And look, I'm starting to think that these are in-rem rights. They last forever. They run with the land. And technically, if you have a PBC that is to be the agent of people who possessed of those rights, then technically they have to run forever as well. So there's got to be a funding regime that's capable of dealing with forever. Now that sounds like nirvana, but if you actually had a capital-based fund, the ILSC operates from a capital-based fund, $1 billion set aside, and it's invested and the returns go. The ABA model from ALRA, and our colleagues from Northern Territory could talk about that. Lots of models, government fund things based on this. We have a sovereign fund for these things. So I would be suggesting, if we're going to be doing all this big, hard work, then there needs to be a capital-based fund so that we can start the work. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We did go a little bit over time, partly because we wanted to give Kevin the opportunity to go through what was obviously a very broad-ranging but thoughtful paper. I really enjoyed particularly the comparison between Gordon and Brennan's judgments. If you pardon the pun, I loved it. Love the case. So, yeah, I'm sure we all look very much forward to the publication of the paper. We'll move into 10 minutes of questions now. By force of academic habit, I have a convention I like to stick to, where if you have a new question or point you'd like to make, it as a hand. If you have a point that is speaking to a question that's currently being asked, it's a finger, if it's a point that you'd like to elaborate on. I have a question just to get things going. From my point of view, the cut of your paper is how do we move towards a more reconciled Australia? From my point of view, one of the key missing elements of this is Indigenous people making decisions that affect Indigenous people's rights. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart obviously recommends a voice to government that localises decision making. Do you think that there's some potential there to move Australia towards a more reconciled country with Indigenous people making decisions on Indigenous policies?
David, look, my view is that we moved prematurely to the concept of reconciliation. We actually had to do some truth-telling. We actually had to have some really hard conversations about what took place. And we then actually had to have a conversation about, well, okay, if that took place, then what is the remedy for that? And I think that actually involves compensation, and then and addressing the power imbalances, and then you can have a meaningful discussion about what peace looks like. And I think we moved too quickly to the concept of reconciliation because there was so much unfinished business. There was so much unfinished business within our own mob. I know, you know, it was kind of like, may have made white people feel good. Let's just have a reconciliation. Let's walk bridges and so forth. Symbolic, very important, and the like. But there was a lot of stuff that needed to be unpacked within our own mobs. I mean, we're still dealing with overlapping claims, and you know, if we don't actually have a conversation about how we're going to culturally govern, and with among our groups culturally govern. And what does that look like? We don't present a very good argument about the other things I'm talking about, so you know, compensation and the like, and the structures. So to me, reconciliation is important. In fact, the preamble is one of the most, of this act is one of the most inspiring preambles I've ever read, and reconciliation is in there. But reconciliation is actually, I think, is the last word in the preamble. It has all these other things you get to get there. But we actually put a bit of cart before horse stuff. And I just think, and I'm not saying that reconciliation is not important, it's fundamental. In fact, it's critical to my thesis. You don't have to have harmonious coexistence, that's what reconciliation looks like, but not because people are feeling guilty or, oh, let's just knock this over so we can get on with doing other things. It's a process. And non-Indigenous Australia has to support Indigenous Australia through these processes, and then we'll have a level playing field and a level discussion without the everyday humdrum of fatigue and poverty and all that kind of stuff. Then we'll actually have a meaningful conversation about what a reconciled country looks like. But I think that we actually are starting to have those hard conversations now, and it's in all the policy environment. We're starting to have those conversations, but you know, we just need to learn about the staccato pace in which things is always done. You're moving forward really quickly and then it stops, and to make it sustainable, we need to have this more nation-building approach to these things, because we need to build our nations first, so we can actually have a meaningful conversation with the broader nation. That's